The judge hadn't even finished clearing his throat when my father leaned back in his chair, smiled like a man already counting his winnings, and said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "She won't be getting anything." Laughter rippled through the room. Someone actually clapped. The mountain lodge my grandfather built with his own hands, worth over $1.5 million, had already been mentally claimed by people who hadn't stepped foot there in years. I didn't react. I didn't defend myself because I knew something they didn't. And when the judge reached the final clause of the will, every smile in that room collapsed at once. The probate courtroom smelled like stale coffee and old paper, the kind of place where time felt heavier than usual. Metal folding chairs lined the walls, scraped thin from decades of nervous shifting. The air conditioner hummed too loudly, as if trying to drown out what everyone already knew was coming. This wasn't really a reading of a will. It was a victory lap. My father sat in the front row, legs crossed, one arm draped casually over the back of the chair beside him. He looked relaxed, confident, the kind of confident you get when you're certain the ending has already been written in your favor. A few cousins leaned in toward him, whispering, grinning. My stepmother dabbed the corner of her mouth with a napkin. She didn't need to. Her eyes flicked toward me just long enough to confirm I was still there. I sat alone in the second row, hands folded in my lap, spine straight. I could feel eyes on me, curious, judgmental, amused. To them, I was the punchline. The estranged granddaughter who'd run off at 18. The girl who'd been written out of the family long before any will was signed. The judge adjusted his glasses and began with the formalities: name, date, place of death. My grandfather's name landed in my chest like a weight. Even now, weeks later, it still didn't feel real that he was gone. He'd been the one steady thing in my life, the only adult who never treated my existence like a disappointment. As per the last will and testament, the judge read, voice measured, practiced. My father shifted, clearing his throat. "We all know how this goes," he said with a chuckle, glancing around the room like he was sharing an inside joke. "Dad made his intentions pretty clear." A few people nodded. Someone murmured, "That's right." Then my father looked straight at me, really looked at me. His smile widened, sharp and satisfied. "She won't be getting anything," he said. "Haven't spoken to her in years." That's when the laughter came. Not cruel exactly. Worse, casual, comfortable, like this outcome made perfect sense. I didn't move. Inside, though, something settled. A calm, steady thing. The same feeling I used to get standing beside my grandfather on the lodge porch at sunrise. The mountains still wrapped in fog. The world quiet enough to breathe. The judge lifted a hand. "Let me finish," he said. My father waved him off, still smiling. "Of course, Your Honor." If he'd looked more closely, he might have noticed my expression. Not fear, not anger, just patience. Because stories like this don't start in courtrooms. They start years earlier in the moments people think don't matter. I was 18 the last time my father spoke to me as his daughter. I remember the exact kitchen where it happened. Yellowed linoleum, a refrigerator that hummed louder than it cooled. I just told him I was leaving for college on a scholarship he hadn't helped me apply for to study something he didn't think was practical. I expected disappointment. I didn't expect exile. "If you walk out that door," he said, voice flat, controlled, "don't come back." I thought he was bluffing. Parents always threaten things they don't mean. He wasn't. The locks were changed the next week. My number went unanswered. Family gatherings happened without me. I learned through secondhand updates and social media photos that life had gone on just fine without my presence complicating things, except for one person. My grandfather never stopped calling. He lived 3 hours away, high in the mountains, in a lodge he'd built board by board after retiring from a lifetime of quiet, steady work. It wasn't flashy, no marble countertops or designer furniture. Just solid wood, wide windows, and a porch that looked out over pine-covered slopes that caught the morning light like they were holding on to it. "Come visit," he'd say. "The air's good up here." So I did, on weekends when I could afford the gas, on holidays when I didn't have anywhere else to go. I slept in the old guest room with the creaky bed and the quilt that smelled faintly of cedar. I helped him stack firewood, fix leaky faucets, Sort through mail he pretended not to understand, just so I'd sit beside him longer. He never asked why my father had cut me off. Never told me to apologize. He just listened. One evening, as we watched the sun dip behind the ridge line, he said, "People like to think loud words make things true. They don't." I didn't know then how much that sentence would matter. Years passed. I built a life piece by piece, jobs that paid just enough, apartments that never quite felt like home. Through it all, my grandfather stayed constant. When his hands started to shake, I helped him with paperwork. When his eyesight faded, I read documents out loud, explaining what they meant: insurance, property taxes, maintenance contracts. The lodge wasn't just property to him. It was proof that something good could be built slowly, carefully, and held on to. And he was paying attention to who showed up, to who didn't. By the time his health declined, my father suddenly remembered the mountains existed. He called more, visited once, talked about keeping things in the family. My grandfather never argued. He just nodded, asked me later to double-check a few things just to be sure, he'd say. Standing in that courtroom now, listening to people laugh at my supposed irrelevance, I thought about those quiet afternoons, the smell of pine sap, the sound of pages turning, the way my grandfather always read everything twice. The judge cleared his throat again. "We will now proceed to the final clause." The room shifted, chairs creaked, the laughter faded into expectation. My father leaned back, arms crossed already, sure to be victorious. I folded my hands tighter and waited. I learned early what it meant to become invisible, not disliked, not abused, just quietly erased. After my father cut me off, my name became something people avoided saying out loud. At first, relatives asked questions out of habit. "How's she doing? Where is she living now?" But those questions faded fast. It was easier for everyone if I stayed a story with no updates, a mistake already corrected. My father remarried within 2 years. New house, new routines, new family photos where I didn't exist. I saw them online, sometimes tagged by cousins who forgot I could still see. Holiday tables crowded with faces that used to be mine too. Captions like, "Family is everything." I learned not to look too long. What surprised me wasn't how quickly they moved on. It was how normal it felt to them, like cutting me off had simply cleaned up a loose end. I worked 2 jobs my first year away, coffee shop mornings, closing shifts at a grocery store at night. I rented a room from a woman who collected ceramic angels and didn't ask many questions. I slept 4 hours a night and told myself it was temporary. Everything was temporary if you kept moving. On Sundays, when exhaustion settled deep in my bones, I drove into the hills just to breathe. Trees didn't look at you like you'd failed them. Mountains didn't ask why you weren't doing better. That's when I started going up to my grandfather's lodge more often. He never treated my visits like charity, never asked how much money I had or whether I was back on my feet. He handed me a mug of coffee, pointed at a chair on the porch, and waited. Silence with him never felt awkward. It felt earned. "Your dad called," he mentioned once, staring out at the trees. I tensed, waiting for the lecture. "He thinks I should sell my lodge," my grandfather continued. "Says the market's right." "And what do you think?" I asked. "I think people talk more when they want something," he said. That was my grandfather. He didn't raise his voice, didn't accuse. He observed, filed things away, and he remembered. As years went on, my role in his life grew quietly. I didn't announce it, I just showed up. When snowstorms hit, I drove up to shovel the porch. When the hot water heater failed, I called a repairman and sat with my grandfather until it was fixed. When paperwork came in thick envelopes with language designed to confuse, I read every line. I started noticing patterns. My father always asked the same questions. What was the property worth now? Who was managing the taxes? Had my grandfather thought about simplifying things? Once I found a draft document on the kitchen table during a visit. It proposed transferring temporary management authority to my father for convenience. The language was slippery, vague, designed to look harmless. I showed it to my grandfather. He read it slowly, then smiled without humor. "They think old means foolish," he said. That night, we sat at the kitchen table long after the sun went down. He pulled out a manila folder thick with records, deeds, appraisals, correspondence, notes he'd made in the margins, neat and precise. "I built this place so no one could rush me," he said quietly. Turns out it kept people patient, just long enough to show who they are. He didn't ask me to choose sides. He never said my father was wrong. He didn't need to. He just started preparing. Over the next year, he involved an independent attorney, someone my father didn't know, didn't control. He asked me to sit in on meetings, to ask questions, to listen. I learned about trusts, about clauses designed to protect intent, about something called a no-contest provision, a quiet little sentence that could silence a lot of noise if someone got greedy. Paper, my grandfather said one afternoon, tapping a document. Doesn't forget. My father visited twice during that time. Each visit felt like a performance. He talked louder than necessary, touched things as if reminding himself they were real. He barely looked at me. Once, while my grandfather stepped out to take a phone call, my father leaned toward me. "You know this doesn't change anything," he said. "He's just being sentimental. When the time comes, it'll be handled properly." I met his gaze. "Handled by who?" He smiled thinly. "Family." The word sounded different coming from him, like a claim, not a bond. When my grandfather's health declined, the visits became more frequent. So did the pressure, calls about simplifying, about easing burdens, about not letting things get complicated. One evening, after a particularly tense call, my grandfather asked me to sit with him on the porch. "I'm not leaving this up to chance," he said, "or guilt, or noise." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper worn at the edges. "This is the last thing," he said. "The clause people skip because they think they already won." I read it twice, then a third time. It was clear, calm, unmistakable. "You sure?" I asked. He nodded. "The people who deserve something won't need to fight for it." The day he passed, the mountains were quiet, too quiet. I stayed until the sun set, until the porch grew cold, and the lodge felt empty in a way it never had before. My father called the next morning. "I'll take care of things," he said. "No need for you to get involved." I thanked him and hung up. And then I waited, because some stories don't end when someone dies. They end when the truth is finally read out loud. The mountain lodge changed after my grandfather was gone, not physically. The beams still held. The windows still caught the morning light the same way they always had, but the silence felt different, thicker, like it was waiting for someone to break it. I stayed there for a week after the funeral, sleeping in the same guest room I had since I was 19. Each night, the wind moved through the trees with a low, steady sound that reminded me of his breathing when he slept in the chair by the fireplace. I kept expecting to hear the creak of his boots on the porch, the soft cough he never quite shook. Instead, there were voicemails from my father. He didn't ask how I was holding up. He didn't mention grief. He talked logistics. "People are asking questions," he said in one message. "It would be better if we present a united front." In another, "There's no reason to drag this out." The third came late at night. His voice was sharper. "Don't make this harder than it has to be." I deleted them all. On the fourth day, I drove down the mountain to meet the attorney my grandfather had hired. His office was small, tucked between a hardware store and a diner that smelled like burnt coffee. No marble floors, no framed diplomas meant to intimidate, just clean desks and thick files. "He was very thorough," the attorney said, sliding a folder toward me, "and very clear. We went through everything line by line, the trust, the deeds, the clauses written in plain language, not legal gymnastics. The last provision sat there quietly, unassuming, the one my grandfather had called the part people skip. It outlined exactly what would happen if anyone attempted to challenge the will or pressure other beneficiaries or publicly misrepresent his intentions. Consequences, real ones. "This is enforceable," the attorney said, "and it's already in effect." I felt something in my chest ease, not relief exactly, more like steadiness, the kind that comes when you know the ground under you won't suddenly give way. When I returned to the lodge that evening, the sky was turning orange behind the peaks. I sat on the porch steps, listening to the quiet, and thought about how many times my grandfather had stood right there, hands in his pockets, surveying the land like it was a responsibility rather than a possession. He never talked about the lodge's value. The number $1.5 million meant nothing to him. What mattered was that the roof didn't leak, that the wood stove worked, that the place could shelter someone who needed it. That night, I found the letter. It was tucked into a book on the shelf near his chair. The spine cracked from decades of rereading. My name was written on the envelope in his careful handwriting. No date, no drama, just my name. I sat at the old kitchen table to read it. He wrote about small things, about watching me learn to stack firewood without smashing my fingers, about the way I always checked receipts twice, even when no one asked me to, about how I never took shortcuts even when they were offered. He wrote about my father, too, not cruelly, honestly. "He's loud," the letter said, and loud men often confuse confidence with correctness. The last paragraph was short. "I am giving you the lodge because you already treat it like something you are responsible for, not entitled to. If anyone is angry about this, they are angry at their own expectations, not my choice." I folded the letter carefully and placed it back where I found it. The calls increased after that. Cousins I hadn't heard from in years suddenly remembered my number. Some were friendly, others were probing, a few were blunt. "You're really going to take this from him?" one asked. "I'm not taking anything," I replied. "I'm receiving what was given." That distinction seemed to make people uncomfortable. 2 weeks later, my stepmother called. Her tone was softer than my father's, but the message was the same. "He's under a lot of stress," she said. "This whole situation is embarrassing." I pictured my grandfather's hands steady as he signed each document. "He planned this," I said. "There's nothing embarrassing about preparation." She sighed. "You always did like to argue." I ended the call politely and went back to repairing a loose board on the porch. The day of the will reading arrived quietly. No dramatic build-up, just a date circled on my calendar and a long drive down the mountain. I packed lightly, no suitcases, no folders. Everything that mattered had already been filed. When I walked into the courtroom, I saw the confidence on my father's face and understood something important. He hadn't read the will. He'd assumed. Assumptions had always worked for him before. As people took their seats, I caught fragments of conversation. "He built that place for the family. She's been gone so long. He wouldn't cut his own son out." I sat where I had in my grandfather's lodge so many times before, quiet, observant, letting people reveal themselves. The judge began reading. My father's impatience grew with every paragraph. Small bequests passed to extended relatives. Items of sentimental value were mentioned. Each one seemed to reinforce his belief that the real prize was already his. He leaned back, relaxed. Then came the pause. The judge adjusted his glasses, cleared his throat, and began to read the clause my grandfather knew everyone would underestimate. The judge's voice didn't change when he reached the clause. That was the unsettling part. No dramatic pause, no shift in tone, just the steady cadence of someone who had read words like these many times before and understood exactly what they could do to a room. "Oh, the remainder of the estate," he read, "including full ownership of the mountain property known as—" My stomach straightened. I could feel it before I saw it, the subtle change in posture, the quiet inhale of someone preparing to receive what they believe is already theirs, "shall be transferred." The judge continued, "Into the irrevocable trust established on March 14th, naming my granddaughter as sole beneficiary and successor trustee." The air went still, not stunned, not confused, suspended, as if the room itself needed a second to process what had just been said. My father blinked once, then laughed, a short, dismissive sound. "That can't be right," he said, turning to the judge. He must mean managed by, temporarily. The judge didn't look up. He kept reading. "The property shall not be sold, transferred, or leveraged by any individual other than the named beneficiary. Any attempt to contest this provision, coerce its reversal, or publicly misrepresent my intentions shall result in immediate forfeiture of all remaining interests." A woman in the back gasped. Someone dropped a pen. The sound echoed too loudly. My stepmother leaned forward, her face pale. "What does that mean?" she whispered. It meant exactly what it sounded like. My father stood. "This is absurd," he said. "I am his son." The judge finally looked up. His gaze was calm, unimpressed. "And this," he said, tapping the page lightly, "is a legally executed document." "But she hasn't been around," my father snapped, gesturing toward me. "She left. She walked away." I met his eyes for the first time that day. "You told me to?" The judge raised a hand. "Sir, please sit down." My father didn't. His face flushed, the confidence draining in real time as something unfamiliar replaced it, uncertainty. "There must be a mistake," he said, turning to the attorney seated beside him. "You said—" The attorney avoided his gaze. The judge continued unhurried. "In addition, the trust includes a recorded letter and notarized statement affirming the testator's mental capacity and intent at the time of signing." He slid a sealed envelope across the desk. My name was on it. The judge nodded to me. "You may open it." I stood on legs that felt steady in a way I hadn't expected. The envelope was heavier than paper should have been. Inside was my grandfather's handwriting, familiar, grounding. "Read it," the judge said. My voice didn't shake. "If you're hearing this," I read, "it means people are arguing over something they never earned." My father exhaled sharply. "I did not make this decision out of spite," the letter continued. "I made it out of clarity. The person who showed up without being asked, who cared without expecting return, who treated this place as a responsibility, that is the person I trust." The word trust landed with intention. "This property is not a prize. It is a duty. Anyone who sees it otherwise should not have it." I folded the letter and lowered my hands. The judge cleared his throat. "For the record," he said, "the trust has been in effect for 18 months. The deed was transferred and recorded. Ownership is not in dispute." Silence. Not awkward silence. Not polite silence. The kind that presses against your ears until you become aware of your own breathing. My father's mouth opened, closed. He looked around the room, searching for agreement, support, someone to contradict what was now undeniable. No one spoke. Finally, he sat slowly, like a man lowering himself into water he hadn't tested. "This is manipulation," he muttered. "She turned him against me." The judge's response was quiet. The letter was written in his own hand, witnessed, notarized. I watched my father read the room the way he always had, gauging power, recalculating. But this time, the math didn't work. He looked at me again. There was anger there, yes, but beneath it something else. Recognition, the realization that the narrative he'd repeated for years, that I didn't matter, that I'd walked away, that I'd forfeited my place, had just been stripped of its authority. The judge closed the file. "This concludes the reading." People began to move, slowly at first, then all at once. Conversations erupted in low, urgent murmurs. Chairs scraped, eyes darted. My stepmother reached for my father's arm. He pulled away. I gathered my things. There was nothing to pack up, no folder, no proof to defend. Everything that mattered had already been said. As I turned to leave, my father spoke again. His voice was different now, quieter, thinner. "You think this makes you right?" I paused. "No," I said. "It makes him clear." I walked out into the hallway. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Somewhere behind me, a door closed, and for the first time since I was 18, I didn't feel like I was leaving something behind. I felt like I was stepping forward. The fallout didn't happen all at once. It never does. It arrived in fragments, half-sentences, side glances, phones vibrating in pockets that hadn't buzzed for years. The hallway outside the courtroom filled with voices trying to sound casual and failing. People spoke softly, as if loud words might somehow reverse what had just been made official. My father stood apart from the cluster, shoulders rigid, staring at the wall like it might offer an explanation he could accept. My stepmother hovered near him, whispering things I couldn't hear. Whatever she was saying, it wasn't helping. I walked past them without stopping. Outside, the afternoon light felt almost offensive in its normality. Cars passed. Someone laughed across the street. The world hadn't paused just because a family story had been rewritten. I sat in my car for a moment before starting the engine, hands resting on the steering wheel, breathing slow and deliberate. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel vindicated. Mostly, I felt tired, not the bone-deep exhaustion of surviving, the quieter kind that comes after something heavy has finally been set down. The calls started that evening, first from a cousin I barely remembered. "We had no idea," she said quickly, like she needed to get the words out before I could hang up. "If I'd known," I let her trail off. People always wanted to rewrite their positions once the outcome was clear. Another cousin texted a single line, "Grandpa always did like you." I didn't reply. My father didn't call that night or the next. Instead, I received an email from an attorney I'd never met, outlining options and next steps. It was carefully worded, polite, and unmistakably probing. I forwarded it to my grandfather's attorney. He responded within the hour. "They can try. It won't go far." I believed him. The trust was airtight by design. My grandfather had anticipated this exact moment, the shock giving way to bargaining, the bargaining curdling into threats. He'd protected against all of it without raising his voice or accusing anyone. He'd simply written the truth down and signed his name. Over the next week, I returned to the lodge. The drive up the mountain felt different now, not heavier, quieter. The road wound through the trees the same way it always had, but this time I wasn't arriving as a guest. I was coming home. The lodge greeted me with familiar smells, wood dust, the faint trace of old coffee. I opened windows, let fresh air in. The place breathed again. I spent the first day doing nothing productive at all, sitting on the porch, watching clouds shift over the peaks, listening to the wind move through the pines. On the second day, I got to work. I made lists, repairs to schedule, accounts to update, insurance policies to review. It felt natural, the way caring always had. Responsibility didn't scare me. It never had. A local property manager stopped by that afternoon. He'd known my grandfather for years. We sat at the kitchen table going over numbers. "You'll do fine," he said almost to himself. He trusted you. That trust mattered more to me than the lodge's value ever could. Back in town, the story continued to evolve. My father's narrative shifted quickly from certainty to disbelief to wounded pride. He told anyone who would listen that he'd been blindsided, that I'd manipulated an old man, that family shouldn't treat family this way. What he didn't say was that he hadn't visited the lodge in over a decade, that he'd tried to rush documents through without reading them, that he'd assumed entitlement would carry him where effort had not. The legal challenge never materialized. The no contest clause did its quiet work. Every attorney he spoke to gave the same advice. Let it go. Contesting would only cost him what little he'd been left. That reality settled in slowly. A month after the reading, my father asked to meet. The message was short, no accusations, no demands, just a location. A diner halfway between the mountain and the town he lived in now. I considered not going. I didn't owe him anything, but I went anyway. The diner was the kind of place that hadn't changed in 30 years. Vinyl booths, coffee poured without asking, a bell that rang every time the door opened. My father stood when I walked in. He looked older than I remembered, not frail, just diminished, as if the certainty he'd carried like armor had finally been removed. "Thank you for coming," he said. We sat. The waitress brought coffee. Neither of us touched it. "I didn't know," he said after a long pause. "I know," I replied. He stared at his hands. He never said anything. "He didn't need to," I said gently. Another silence. This one different, less defensive, more exposed. "I thought you'd be fine," he said finally. "You always were." There it was, the sentence that had shaped everything. "I was," I said. But that didn't mean I didn't matter. He nodded once, a small movement, acceptance maybe, or something close to it. "I can't change what I did," he said, "but I wanted you to know. I see it now." I didn't offer forgiveness, not because I was holding on to anger, but because some things can't be rushed. Healing, like trust, takes time and consistency. We paid separately. When I left, the mountains were already visible in the distance, their outline steady against the sky. I drove back up that evening as the sun dipped low, turning the trees gold. The lodge waited, unchanged, patient. Inside, I lit a fire, sat in the chair my grandfather loved, and for the first time since the reading, I allowed myself to feel something like peace, not because I'd won, but because the truth had finally been spoken and held. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm I hadn't known I was missing. Not excitement, not relief, something steadier, the kind of calm that doesn't announce itself, but stays. I moved between the lodge and town, learning the small, unglamorous details that keep a place alive. Furnace filters, snow removal contracts, septic inspections. The work didn't feel burdensome. It felt familiar, like finishing a sentence someone else had started. People up here remembered my grandfather. They remembered who showed up. The hardware store owner asked how he was before catching himself. The woman at the post office told me she was glad the lodge stayed with family, then corrected herself. With the right family, she said. I didn't argue. Letters came in my grandfather's name for a while. I forwarded what mattered, filed the rest, closed accounts carefully the way he would have wanted. Each task felt like a conversation we were still having. Down the mountain, things were less quiet. My father's silence stretched longer than I expected. Then, abruptly, it broke. He showed up at the lodge one afternoon without calling. I saw his car first, parked too close to the porch like he was bracing himself for a claim. I didn't rush. I finished washing my hands at the sink, dried them slowly, and stepped outside. He stood near the railing, staring out at the trees. The view had always unsettled him, too open, too much space to think. You didn't tell me you were coming, I said. He turned, startled. I didn't think I had to. That's new, I replied evenly. He winced, but said nothing. We stood there for a moment, the wind threading through the pines, carrying the scent of damp earth. Finally, he spoke. You've changed it, he said, gesturing toward the lodge. I fixed what needed fixing, I said. Nothing more. He nodded, eyes scanning the porch, the chairs, the swing my grandfather had built. His jaw tightened. You could sell it, he said. Cash out, be done. I won't. You don't know how hard it is to maintain something like this. I met his gaze. I do. That silence again, the kind that asks a question without words. I came to talk about options, he said finally. We could work something out. I waited. A partnership, he continued. You keep the name. I help manage. Make it easier. There it was, the old instinct, control disguised as cooperation. I'm already managing, I said. And it's easier than you think. His frustration flared. You're doing this to punish me. I shook my head. I'm doing this to protect what Grandpa built. That's the same thing, he snapped. No, I said quietly. It's the opposite. He looked away, down at the steps. His shoulders slumped just a fraction. You always were stubborn, he muttered. I smiled then, not unkindly. I learned from watching you. That landed. He laughed once, short and hollow. Your grandfather would have enjoyed this, he said. Yes, I agreed, he would have. We talked a little longer after that about practical things, boundaries, what would and wouldn't happen next. I was clear, calm. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. When he left, he didn't slam the car door. It wasn't reconciliation. It was something more honest. After he drove away, I sat on the porch steps until the light shifted. I thought about how many times I'd been told to compromise, to keep the peace, to smooth things over for the sake of family. Peace built on silence was never peace at all. Winter came early that year. Snow dusted the mountains before Thanksgiving. I prepared the lodge the way my grandfather taught me, weatherproofing, stocking supplies, checking the generator. On the first heavy snowfall, I watched from the window as the world went quiet and white. The lodge held. I received a handwritten note in December. No return address, but I recognized the handwriting immediately. I was wrong, it said, about a lot of things. I don't expect forgiveness, but I wanted you to know I see you. I folded it and placed it in the drawer with my grandfather's letters. Some truths don't need responses. By spring, the lodge had begun hosting again, not loudly, not commercially. Friends of friends, families who wanted quiet. A retired couple celebrating 40 years together, a teacher on sabbatical writing by the fire. Each guest left something behind, a note, a memory, a sense that the place was still doing what it was meant to do. One evening, as the sun sank low and painted the mountains gold, I stood on the porch and thought about the courtroom, the laughter, the certainty that had filled the room before the judge read the final clause. I hadn't raised my voice then either. I hadn't needed to because preparation speaks louder than performance, and care outlasts entitlement every time. My grandfather understood that. He trusted paper to hold the truth when people couldn't. And standing there, listening to the wind move through the trees, I understood something else. I wasn't just the beneficiary of his decision. I was the continuation of it. By the time summer settled into the mountains, the lodge felt fully awake again, not busy, not noisy, alive. Mornings began with light spilling across the wooden floors, dust motes drifting lazily in the air like they had nowhere else to be. I brewed coffee the way my grandfather used to, strong, no fuss, and carried it out to the porch where the mountains waited in their quiet patience. Some days I worked, some days I simply sat and listened. Both felt necessary. The family, for the most part, learned to keep their distance. A few cousins tried to reconnect, testing the waters with casual messages and vague invitations. I answered politely when it felt sincere. When it didn't, I let silence do its work. Silence, I'd learned, could be a boundary just as firm as any legal clause. My father came once more that summer. This time, he called first. "I'll only stay a few minutes," he said, no assumptions, no claims. When he arrived, he didn't step onto the porch until I invited him. That alone told me something had shifted. He walked slowly, hands in his pockets, eyes taking in details he'd ignored for years. The new railing, the repaired steps, the herb pots by the door. "You've taken good care of it," he said. "I learned from the best," I replied. He nodded. We sat side by side, not facing each other, looking out at the trees the way my grandfather and I used to. The quiet stretched, but it wasn't uncomfortable. "I spent a long time believing something," my father said finally, "that if I controlled the outcome, everything else would fall into place." I waited. I see now how much I missed. It wasn't an apology, not exactly, but it wasn't denial either. And sometimes with people like him, that was as close as the truth ever came. "I'm not asking for anything," he added quickly. "I just didn't want the last thing between us to be that courtroom." I thought about the 18-year-old version of myself standing in a kitchen with a backpack and nowhere to go, about the years of being spoken about instead of spoken to, about how long it had taken to stop measuring my worth by his approval. "It isn't," I said at last. "But it also isn't undone." He swallowed. "Fair." When he left, he didn't look back at the lodge. He looked at me. And that mattered more than I expected. Later that evening, I found myself standing in my grandfather's old workshop, the smell of sawdust still clinging faintly to the walls. Tools hung exactly where he'd left them. I ran my fingers along the workbench, remembering his hands, steady, sure, patient. He'd known this would be hard. He'd known people would be angry, that voices would rise, that laughter would turn sharp when expectations were challenged. And still, he'd chosen clarity. I took out the letter he'd written me, smoothing the edges, reading it one last time in the fading light. "This place doesn't need someone who wants to own it," he'd written. "It needs someone who wants to keep it." That was the difference no one else in that courtroom had understood. Ownership was loud. It demanded recognition. Stewardship was quiet. It showed up early, stayed late, and didn't need applause.